Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about the Bobo doll experiment by
I'm Rahul.
Nishanth.
Gabby.
Nadiya.
David. Next slide, please. Summary. What is the Bobo doll experiment? Well, the Bobo doll experiment is an experiment that investigates if human behaviors are learned by imitating society or inherited genetic factors. The experiment consisted of three groups of children, both male and female. The first group of children was exposed to a video of an adult playing with a Bobo doll with aggressive behavior. They were then put in another room with a Bobo doll. The second group of children was exposed to a video of an adult playing with a Bobo doll with a non aggressive behavior. They were then put in a room with a Bobo doll in it. The last group of children was not exposed to a video of any sort. They were just put in a room with a Bobo doll. The the result of this experiment will shock you, but that will be later in the slides. Now, reason why did we choose this study? We chose this study because it piqued our interest. And second, the study dives into the mind of a child, and while children mimic what they see in adults or role models or TV or video games. Why is this essential for psychology? This is essential for psychology because it's groundbreaking research on aggression. And the experiment tells us why children act the way they do and why they are always aggressive or submissive. The social learning of Bandura emphasizes the importance of behavior, attitude, and emotional reaction. Oh, how can this help us understand ourselves? The research help us people understand more of themselves and more of their children. People will realize why their kids are acting the way they do. It tells us how our action impacts others and not just ourselves. Next slide, please.
The Bobo doll experiment was conducted at Stanford University in 1961 by Albert Bandura with assistance from Dorothea Ross and Sheila A. Ross. Albert Bandura is an influential social cognitive psychologist and is best known for the social learning theory, the concept of self-efficiency, and for the Bobo doll experiment. His work is often considered to be a part of the cognitive revolution, which is the impact on personality and cognitive psychology, as well as education and psychotherapy, and like stated before, is often identified as one of the most influential psychologists of all time. Next slide, please. Now, what aspect of human behavior did researchers want to explore? According to Saul McLeod and Kendra Cherry, researchers wanted to see if social behavior could be acquired by observation and imitation, and if aggression and violence are learned behaviors. They explored if the gender of a child and/or adult influenced what the child had learned. According to Bandura's social learning theory, learning occurs through the observation and interactions with other people. People basically learn by watching others and their social interactions and imitating those actions. He says aggression lies at the root of many social ills. Next slide, please.
Going on to the experiment in depth and detail, Bandura, when he conducted the psychology experiment, wanted to make sure that everything was equal and uniform so that there would be no discrepancies in the results. In order to do this, he divided the group of 72 children into a total of 36 boys and 36 girls. All of these children were 3 to 6 years old at the Stanford University Nursery School. This is because during this age, psychology and mental development in a child's brain is huge during that time. So we wanted to see if the experiment had an impact on children's brains. During this experiment, the researchers observed the aggression that was performed by the children on a 1 through 5 scale. The children were taken into a room with either a doll or no doll in it. If there was a doll, it was either attacked or subdued. In the chart on the right, you can see the distribution of how the children were taken into a room. Out of a total of 72 children, they were divided into 3 groups. 1/3, or 24 students, 24 children were the aggressive role model group, 24 with a non-aggressive doll, and 24 as a control group with a no doll. The control group was to make sure whether the doll even had any impact on children's psychology and well-being. For the aggressive model, there was a female model and a male model, equally distributed with 6 boys and 6 girls each. The same thing happened with the non-aggressive model. There was a female model and a male model, each one with 6 boys and 6 girls each as well. In addition, the room also contained other materials such as toys and pictures, because researchers wanted to see the effect of how other objects could impact children's behavior. Next slide, please. After the children either saw the doll subdued or attacked, or even if there was no doll at all, the children were taken to another room for a total of 20 minutes. In this room, there were toys that were both aggressive and non-aggressive. For example, there could be another type of doll, or there could be a toy gun that the children could play with. Additionally, the children were told that these toys were specially brought in for them, because the researchers wanted to see whether that had an impact on the children's behavior as well. After they were placed in the room by themselves, the researchers observed the children through a one-way mirror or glass pane every 5 seconds, for a total of 240 responses, which divides perfectly into 20 minutes. During this observation period, specific behaviors were noted. For example, if a child was punching a toy, or if they're doing something else to another toy, that was recorded and jotted down quickly. Throughout this experiment, there were several ethical issues that have been recently brought out to the spotlight. For example, now the harm of the participants is being put into questioning, because the habits that had been enforced during the psychology experiment might have stayed throughout them, because during the development stage of a child, behavior is easily caught and trapped and learned over there. Additionally, the nursery teachers assumed that the children's parents actually gave consent to this experiment, when in reality, they did not even know that this is happening. This is a huge problem in today's society, because usually nothing can happen without consent of another person. Additionally, Bandura argued that social benefits that came out of the psychology experiment outweighed the children's risk, which is putting the innocent lives at risk. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I posted a video that shows whether a doll was being attacked, and afterwards how children reacted to another doll or toy when they were placed in a separate room.
In our experiment, preschool children observed an adult model beat up an inflated Bobo doll in novel ways. She pummeled it with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, and threw it down and beat it. And these novel acts were embellished with hostile remarks. The children were then left in the playroom that had a variety of toys. Now, the children who had observed the aggressive modeling adopted much of it. They even invented new ways for attacking the doll.
So what we just viewed was a video filmed during the experiment. Now on to some of the results. This experiment yielded a number of significant discoveries regarding children and their relation to violence. Both genders observed and noted the model's offensive actions towards the Bobo doll and thought it was appropriate and acceptable to follow those steps. The next finding was that the group of children who viewed the less aggressive video didn't mimic those actions and weren't as aggressive and did respond accordingly. What we can conclude from these findings is that children observe adult behavior and afterwards reinforce that in their own lives, which can actually lead to resentment and rage issues. Now, moving on to other findings, the experiment has also shown a gender difference. According to the findings of the experiment, boys were more violent towards the Bobo doll than girls. In addition, boys who saw male models rather than female models acted more violently against the doll. Their aggressive acts totaled 104 compared to the 48 acts committed by boys who viewed the female model. Now, as for the girls, they replicated the model's verbal aggression rather than the physical actions. The girls would mimic phrases like pow or kick me. Next slide, please. So there's many shocking and surprising findings from this experiment, but these were the ones we found the most surprising. The first was that Bandura's claim was correct. We did not expect so many children to be affected by the same gender model. The next interesting result was that both genders, regardless of their group, displayed a slight amount of aggression towards the doll. We expected the children to ignore the doll or play with other toys that were also placed in the environmental testing, but we did not expect them to use those toys against the doll to attack the doll. The last shocking discovery was that children will observe an adult's behavior and later mimic those moves, which can lead to problems. Overall, this experiment demonstrates how vital it is to exhibit a positive behavior when around children because they are indeed watching your every move. Next slide, please.
So let's get into the conclusion of our presentation. So in this section, we'll be first of all summarizing the key points, outlining specific impacts and what the effect of this experiment is on legislation and research today. The key points that are first learned are, first of all, are aggression and violence learned behaviors? The answer to this, as proven, is yes. Actions have influence. And this was the case for the kids as well. As mentioned earlier, aggressive control groups mimic the behavior of violence towards the dolls, and non-aggressive groups showed less anger and violence. This clearly shows how adult influence can be linked to anger. But the questions and findings that still rise from this specific area of implication are still being explored, which moves on to the second finding, the difference between gender and aggression. Seeing how boys and girls showed aggression in different ways, it raises question for the future of whether gender and sex cause different brain development in the individual. The key to this is important, as being showed before, boys are more likely to exhibit aggression compared to girls and do it in more physical ways compared to girls who do it in more verbal ways. While this has been used as an excuse throughout history to justify sexism, this still is an important finding to look into on ways that we can really explain the youth and educate them to be less violent or less aggressive overall. The third final principle is the fundamental principle of aggression. As mentioned before, there are multiple types of expressions of aggression, such as physical aggression, cognitive aggression, verbal aggression, and instrumental aggression. These are all important to be considered when you're talking about child development in youth. And as David mentioned in the first slide, what these type of aggressions and ways you can explain how kids are always so subtle or angry are all part of a larger scheme in terms of the overall impacts of this experiment. Next slide, please. Now let's move on to the important takeaways and ways that you can relate this to future studies. While the findings that supported Bandura's social learning theory, there's still a lot of questions that arose from the idea of implication. First of all, what is the impact of media on the effect of child aggression, which includes like movies, video games, etc. This really became a talking issue after the Atlanta shootings in 2017, where former President Donald Trump, mentioned how he felt that video games were responsible for a large part of the mass shootings, adding a new factor into the gun control debate. While most people disagreed, there's still a large split in terms of in terms of disagreeing individuals. But rather than it being based off of party, it was based off of age, as younger generations were more likely to support video games, while older generations reference this study in particular when it comes to its effects on gun control as an overall. This is also important to consider when it comes to video games, as this implicated direct effect of media can also be on the types of media. For example, games such as Mortal Kombat with a lot of gore and violence might impact the brain differently compared to less flashy video games, such as Super Smash Bros., which is still a fighting game in its inherent nature, but has different effects and different more flashy figures. It's also important to look at the imprinting behavior and its effects on genetic stream, and especially in abusive households and low-income areas. Considering how 70,000 children suffer from child abuse every single year, the National Children's Lives found that 3 out of 5 individuals are more likely to become the perpetrator later on in their lives. This is a clear example of how the Bobo doll experiment affects the youth and its future. But what is also important is the genetic way that most of this information is transferred throughout genetic transfer of violence throughout generations. If your father were to be more aggressive towards you, then you as an individual are more likely to exhibit signs of trauma or submissiveness based off of that violence. All these studies show that how this experiment has aged like fine wine, and its implications still have effect today. Next slide, please. Thank you for listening to our presentation. Let's go on to the works cited.